So how did the James Bond films influence modern cinema? Well, in order to answer this question, I'm going to split this short video into 3 parts. Why is that? Well, first of all, because many of the elements that we see in James Bond films actually had their origin in earlier films. After all, the world don't begin and end with James Bond. Part 1. The world before Bond. So many of the set pieces that we see in Bond films actually appeared in earlier films. First of all, there are lots of really great gunfights in westerns. Westerns also often featured some pretty great fistfights. And like Bond, westerns tended to feature a lone hero figure, who would face down a seemingly insurmountable challenge. He would manage to hold his nerve and through various acts of courage and daring defeat a more powerful or numerous foe. You also saw car chases in films before Bond, but these tended to be quite basic by modern standards because of various technical limitations, like heavy cameras for example. While they are obviously a pretty minor feature of Bond films, there are also lots of really fun sword fights in films like Sinbad and Robin Hood. And then historical epics like Ben-Hur and Spartacus had lots of great fight scenes too. And they also had chase sequences. Ben-Hur even originated the idea of the tyre slasher that you see in Goldfinger, as well as a more high-tech version in The Living Daylights. The Bond franchise also borrowed the idea of the cliffhanger from serials, especially the idea of the daring escape, where the hero would somehow get out of a seemingly impossible situation. And across many of these different films you also had an handsome hero, and normally at the end the hero would win the heart of a glamorous girl. So a lot of these elements are in movies before Bond, which begs the question, what's the big deal about Bond anyway? Well, like I was saying, Bond didn't really invent many of the set pieces that it's famous for. Cinema audiences had been seeing these sort of set pieces in films long before Bond. But Bond did create a magic formula, where these elements were all combined. In the 1950s, a film like North by Northwest really had only one set piece, whereas in the Bond films you started to see an whole bunch of them. So there are signs of this in the first 2 Bond films, but the complete Bond package really comes together for the first time in Goldfinger. So whereas westerns had gunfights, and historical epics had sword fights, Bond has gunfights, car chases, fistfights, daring escapes.
Do you expect me to talk?
No, Mr. Bond, I expect you to die.
Explosions, more explosions. Oh, and did I mention explosions? Bond also had lots of,
Pussy.
well, loads of sex scenes too. Basically, if you can name it, Bond's got it.
Well, I'm flattered.
But the distinctive thing about Bond is how the franchise managed to pack all of these things together in a distinctive formula. So as well as gadgets, you also had exotic locales and glamorous girls, as well as a very memorable signature theme song.
Bond. James Bond.
But the other big impact of the Bond franchise was its innovations in stunt work. Now of course stunts had also been in movies long before. After all, there are a lot of stunts in Buster Keaton movies, and that goes all the way back to the 1920s. But the Bond films introduced a new type of standard. They were more extreme and impressive than anything audiences had seen before, and they raised the bar for action films that followed. So while there were lots of really great stunts before, this trend really started in The Spy Who Loved Me, with Bond skiing off the edge of a snowy mountain. and then his parachute opened. In addition to the innovations in stunt work, James Bond also introduced a more elaborate set design. So this bloke called Ken Adam was a big part of what made James Bond a success, and he was the set designer for most of the early films. Then Ken Adam really went to town in Goldfinger. So these are very complicated and impressive sets that are also animated. They had lots of moving parts, and somehow it all worked. At the time, these sets were unusual for their scale and the fact that they were so imaginative and impressive. This was all part of a large and bold vision. So it's no exaggeration to say that Ken Adam changed modern cinema forever. Anyway, we're in a better position now to return to the main topic of this video. The Bond legacy. Now, the first influence of Bond on modern cinema that I want to talk about is in the area of parodies. First of all, you had a bunch of these very early on in the 1960s. But the main one, and the one that everyone knows, didn't come along until the 1990s. And that, of course, was Austin Powers. Then, of course, you had your slightly less funny and slightly less clever parodies like Spy Hard and Johnny English. Then secondly, I think we have to say that lots of modern spy films probably wouldn't exist if it weren't for Bond. Just think of James Bond, for example, which when it boils down to it is essentially an American version of James Bond. Or think of the more recent Kingsman franchise, which also contains direct references to Bond. And then of course you had the Arnold Schwarzenegger film True Lies, which borrowed very heavily from Bond. More generally, I think the long history of elaborate stunts in the James Bond franchise was a big inspiration for the Mission Impossible series, particularly because many of their stunts are very similar, if you consider things like this parachute jump. But the Bond franchise had a much broader impact on action films in general, with their typical mix of car chases, fist fights, elaborate stunts, glamorous girls, and a lone hero with special skills, which is still making its presence felt today in films like John Wick and Taken. And that's to say nothing of loads of minor films that have a strong influence of Bond. Films like Night and Day, for example, which borrowed very heavily from Bond, as well as films that are influenced in more subtle or unexpected ways. Just think of Indiana Jones, which came about because Steven Spielberg wasn't able to direct a Bond film. So he created an hero all of his own, which borrowed certain elements to the James Bond persona. And then lastly, the thing I want to mention is that lots of modern directors were also influenced by the James Bond franchise. And the director who stands out most of all in this regard is Christopher Nolan.
The influence of those movies on my filmography is embarrassingly apparent.
You can see this influence generally in his preference for practical effects over CGI, as well as the fact that he borrows lots of ideas directly from the James Bond franchise. The Dark Knight Rises, for example, borrows heavily from License to Kill, in the opening plane stunt. Meanwhile, in the previous Batman film The Dark Knight, you can see the influence of From Russia With Love, in the idea of the Joker having a knife that comes out the top of his shoe. But the Nolan film that's most like a James Bond film is Inception. You can see the influence of Bond in the diverse range of foreign locales in this film. After all, Cobb visits Paris, Tokyo, Mombasa, New York and Los Angeles. But Nolan makes the point that Bond films take you into a bigger world than you could have imagined. The Bond franchise wows audiences with breathtaking spectacle. And this is probably the greatest thing about the Bond franchise, and its impact on cinema more generally. It's pure escapism. The Bond franchise has taken audiences all over the world to a luxurious and opulent world of fantasy that's beyond the grasp of most people. For 2 hours it allows you to forget about the boring circumstances of your own life.
Now all you need is one of those little foreign sports cars that he drives.